So I'm going to talk today about avian influenza. I know you've talked already about influenza in this class. So there's, some good learning that you've already done that connects to specifically avian influenza. And of course, for me in environmental health, I like this example because it connects with a lot of other things in our environment, what's going on in the way that we manage our food system and how that influences transmission and spread or potential for it to move into our human population. Things that are going on in the climate connect as well. So we'll talk a little bit about those, but I'll go ahead and share my screen and get started with the slides. We're going to talk about avian influenza or avian flu, and there were lots of fun images to pull from this, right? This is really current as we're continuing in our 21, 22, 2023 outbreak of avian influenza, and we can continue to see the impacts at the cash register as we have had a decrease in egg availability and a subsequent increase in cost. Today I wanted to go over a little bit about just kind of the basics, history and incidents, a few things, and talk about, human impact, human virulence and human cases, and then think a little bit about its impact on wildlife, its impact in poultry, in our, poultry factories, and what that means in terms of our food system or how our food system is changing risk and spread. And then a little bit about spread and surveillance and management and what that all means for the potential of an avian influenza pandemic. So, hopefully, by the end of our talk, you'll have a good sense of kind of the public health impact of avian influenza outbreaks and be able to discuss a little bit some of the strategies for management and prevention of those outbreaks and evaluate or think about the potential for future pandemics from avian influenza. So I know that you have already learned about this, but there are four main strains of avian influenza, or four main strains of influenza, and it's the type A that produces avian influenza, and it's been it is the aquatic birds and shorebirds are the main reservoir for avian influenza. So that includes a whole great number of different birds, but ducks and gulls and geese and swans. And these are migratory birds that have the ability to move and spread the virus. And the nomenclature, I don't know if you talked about this, but there's a couple of different proteins that lend themselves to the naming of these viruses. So the HA proteins and the NA proteins that are on the surface of the virus are what we use to name these things. So when you talk about H5N1, you're referring to the HA5 protein and the NA1 protein, and that's why we're calling it H5N1 virus. But there are a bunch of different ones. So there's three main ones that have been found in humans, and for the most part, the avian influenza in wild birds is pretty mild. It can be asymptomatic or pretty mild. But it's divided into two groups where we have the low versus the highly pathogenic avian influenza, right? So it's appropriately named. It's highly pathogenic. So we do have some that create a really severe illness in wild birds, and in poultry. That the highly pathogenic avian influenza has a really high mortality rate. It's around 90 to 100% in poultry. So in humans, however, both the low and the highly pathogenic avian influenza can cause mild and severe disease, but we usually see severe illness when in the instances where humans have contracted the disease and been sick, become sick. We haven't seen any human-to-human transmission, although there was a recent case in Cambodia where an 11-year-old girl got sick and died, and her father also tested positive, but likely that they didn't pass it to each other. So we haven't yet seen any human-to-human transmission, but that's of course what we're afraid of. That would be the problem scenario, and the perfect green light for a pandemic if this virus mutates in a way that makes it possible for us to pass it between each other. The three types, H5N1, which is what we're dealing with in our current outbreak, H7N9 and H9N2 are the ones that we've seen primarily in the human cases that have occurred. And most of those cases have been from human contact with infected poultry. The transmission is through saliva and mucus, and can also happen through the feces of the infected bird, but it can be airborne. We know that most influenza in general is contracted in people through airborne droplets and possibly dust. And so when we're thinking about avian influenza and how we're controlling it, that's a place where we could probably put more attention. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. This is data from just looking at H5N1 from 2003 through 2021, and these are just human cases for that strain of avian influenza. And so there's nothing in the US on this graph at all, right? The very first case of avian influenza in the US happened just at the end of 2022. It was a person who worked in Colorado at a poultry factory who was the first US case of avian influenza. But when you look at this, there's, overall this is, small, especially when we're used to thinking about COVID and such a huge pandemic, right? These are, in the last 3 decades, something like 600 total deaths in humans, or cases in humans have occurred. And I wonder what you think might be going on in the places where we have seen it more. So the current outbreak in the US, the preceding avian influenza outbreak was in 2015. And kind of looking at this graph of data, it looks like some potential learning, right? Like, okay, this is what's happening between 2003 and 2009. There were a lot more cases, and we saw a reduction for the most part, except for Egypt. But then in 2020 and 2021, things were a lot better. And I'm just wondering if you all can hazard a few guesses. Let me bring your faces back up on my screen about what might be leading. Why have we seen it in these places in the world potentially? What might you hazard as a guess?
Just go ahead and unmute yourselves and guess.
I would guess, I don't know so much about like Egypt or Indonesia, but as a Vietnamese American, I can speak a little bit about what I know about Vietnam. And I think maybe sanitation and hygiene might have to do a little bit because and it's also in cases of there's a lot of people, the population is very dense. A lot of people can be in one city, but I think maybe sanitation, hygiene.
Yeah, I think that's a great guess, right? So we know that one of the ways that we're trying to manage this, so funny the terms that people pick, but they're calling it security, just basically managing infections at the factories, right, and trying to prevent spread, so sanitizing things. So I think that's a perfectly great potential reason of something that might add to increased risk is, maybe less opportunity or less education or less information or less enforcement or whatever, less sanitation in large populations. Any other guesses? There isn't really a right answer because there isn't, but there's things going on and people studying and looking at risk dynamics. What other thoughts might be going on here? So if we know that the big natural reservoir is wild birds, it's really high mortality in poultry. What might you think about in other places, and where? Is that a hint or not? I don't know. Maybe it's not a good hint. Any other ideas? There's only 4 of us, so we can sit.
None of these countries are landlocked. I don't know if that really makes a big difference.
Yeah, well, I think that's something to think about. Is sort of, that's what I'm throwing out with the idea of like wild birds is where are they moving, where are they in contact with people, with the poultry and with the people who look after the poultry, right? So I think it's worth thinking about, right? And a lot of them are they're water birds, they're shorebirds, and ducks and things that sit in low ponds and fresh water and land and spend time in areas with water. So thinking about kind of what the geography of the place is, I think that's reasonable, and where the people are, right? That's really important, is kind of where are the hosts and where are the people. And that's what we see when we're thinking about kind of a lot of emerging infectious diseases, is where are the host populations, where are the people, and as we see those populations moving and coming into more contact, that's when we have a great opportunity for zoonotic diseases to be created, right? We have that contact between the different populations, and we can end up with a mutation and a species jump. So, I don't actually know the answer to the question of what's going on in all of these in each country is different, and there's different dynamics going on. Some of the things that are mentioned in the literature are live bird markets in parts of Asia, being a big part of the population. So people coming into contact with live birds in their shopping at markets, and those are mostly poultry, but are other kinds of birds and can be some wild birds. There's also conversation. Now, this is interesting, and I think it's worth discussion, because there is discussion in the literature about the high proportion of poultry produced in backyards and small scale farming. And so I'd like to, bring this up later and kind of brainstorm a little bit, because here we have big industrial farms, and we spend a lot of time in environmental health talking about big industrial farms and how they really become the perfect petri dish for a lot of genetic mutations for diseases, viruses, and bacteria. Pathogens can really move through these populations so quickly because they live in such close confined areas. And with the short life cycle of these pathogens moving through a big population, it offers a great opportunity for genetic change and genetic evolution, right? And that reassortment of the, I think maybe you talked about the antigenic shift, right? Where we have a big chunk of the DNA recombined to create a whole new virus. So we often think of these concentrated animal farming operations, these big industrial factories for animals, as being a great space for really spreading diseases. And yet in the literature, I saw some mention of like, oh, well, this is a higher risk because there's more of this small scale farming. The difference here is that there's more opportunity for contact in small scale farms and backyards with the wild birds. So potentially more contact with that big host population. And there's also a lot more contact with the population, with the people, right? So at our industrial farms, the only people that come in contact with those birds are the people who work there, right? So there's a factory population of workers that are at risk from being exposed. And it's a lot more controlled environment, if you will. So if you wanted to, and if you had good regulations and enforcement, you could create some systematic approaches for what we were talking about earlier, for that sanitation, for personal protective equipment, for restricting human exposure and contact, versus a big open population. I don't know if anyone has traveled to or lived in or just can imagine places where there's chickens running everywhere, right? That everybody's chickens are running everywhere and are in contact with a lot of people outside of the people who are actually the owners of those those chickens, right? And so there's a potential more human contact in those small scale farms and less kind of control and regulation. More human contact, but also more contact with wild animals, and less potential to kind of manage that contact and minimizing risk, right? And then just what who said it? Hillary, you mentioned sanitation, right? Well, just in general, weaker, the biosafety and biosecurity terms crack me up, right? But weaker sanitation practices in terms of policies or oversight in terms of how farms are run when there are so many small backyard farms, and how things happen in sales and markets and commercial, as opposed to a big industrial setting, which has its real weaknesses, but in this case can be regulated in a certain way that smaller markets and big outdoor open markets cannot or have not. And in Egypt, avian influenza is now enzootic. I think the first outbreak in Egypt of H5N1 was in 2005 or 2006. And then by 2008, it was enzootic in the poultry. So it was just regularly occurring constantly, in the poultry population. And so they had a couple of big outbreaks and a lot of human cases in Egypt. And some places had focused on, and then we kind of later on we'll talk more about what do we do if there's an outbreak and how do we manage that. And there's different strategies, and some places focused a lot on vaccinating the birds and not on any other kind of management around reducing exposure to the human population or sanitation procedures, right? And the current vaccine that you can use for birds makes the birds test positive, so then you can't tell who has it and who doesn't, or which bird. So there's probably a lot of other different dynamics and different in each different country, but just some food for thought and things to think about. So how's it impacting wildlife? This is something that our wild birds of the reservoir, it's been around for some 25 years in wild birds. And mostly it is a mild illness or asymptomatic in these birds. We have surveillance and testing in the US. It's affected roughly 6,000 wild birds, but compare that to 58 million poultry birds, right? So the numbers are just massive when we look, and this is precisely because of those weaknesses of our big animal farms, is that we have these large populations living close together. So it's really easy for something to spread quickly in those populations. Even though those wild birds are moving around, they're not in such high, just like a human population, right? When we're all living in really close quarters in big cities, it's a lot easier for things to spread than when we're out in rural areas. And so it spreads really quickly in those factories, the poultry factories. And so we've had a lot of more deaths, and we've been culling them. Our policies have been, if one bird is infected, kill all the ones around it, so that you minimize risk that they might also get it. And so there's just all this sacrificing of a lot of birds to try to stop the spread and contain that, right? It becomes untenable at some point to just keep killing off all the birds. And so thinking about what are the other ways that we can kind of get a hold on this. And that's why people are talking about vaccinations for the birds. So I don't know, there's some typo here in the next thing, but basically around 6,000 wild birds, and these are samples, so we don't know a total number count for all the birds that might be carrying the virus, because what we're doing is trying to set up our surveillance and sampling to get a good sense of kind of, if we get the right power in our sampling, we should be able to predict what the total viral load is in the populations. We understand the sizes and the populations of those birds. But it's affected a lot of different bird species. And it's now moving. We've seen it in a lot of different animals and other mammals. And so I think in Peru, there was a mass mortality event of sea lions from avian influenza, right? So that then was passing mammal to mammal infections. And this is when we start to have red flags and worry, has there been a mutation that might be allowing this to be transmissible? If it's transmissible between sea lions, is it going to be transmissible? It's easier, more likely, more genetic similarity to pass between us, other mammals, right? And we saw another outbreak in a mink farm, and it was again passing between the minks, and so there are impacts on, you know, like anything, right? When we start to have diseases occurring in our wild populations, we impact that food web and the food chain, and can have kind of trickle down ecological disturbance impacts, right? And kind of connect back to those eco-health connections to our human health. We need that biodiversity. We rely on it. It's really important for our own survival and health long term. We don't see as immediate connections, but when we follow the threads, we can see human health impacts from those shifts in the ecosystem. So we know that this is important. It's important to know that it's impacting a lot of different animals, a lot of different birds, but there's not a lot of research to kind of try connect those threads yet between kind of the impact on human health through ecosystem shifts. But they're definitely happening when we have these big outbreaks. But for the most part, right, at least in the birds, they continue to kind of be okay. And, you know, if they get sick, they, you know, some of them die, but a lot of them are continuing on and spreading the virus without being sick themselves. Okay, so there's, you know, the concern of it getting in humans. We had one, and it's you know, a pretty severe illness when we do see it in humans. And we had one case in Colorado, but we don't see it yet, fortunately, passing human to human. And so what we're seeing in terms of our community health impacts are the food supply and the food cost, right? The issues that have been happening that we're aware of because it's impacting us directly, and the big economic impacts, right? These are giant industries that are being impacted. So there is, you know, eventual connections across our economy. As we impact one sector, it connects with others, right? And there is concern of the potential impact on vaccine production. We haven't seen this, but a lot of vaccines are produced from what's the word? Specific pathogen-free eggs. So we use eggs for the growth and production, the manufacture and production of vaccines. Something like 82% of our flu vaccine comes from these SPF eggs. We also use them for other vaccines, MMR vaccines, yellow fever vaccines. And so if those chickens that are laying those eggs that we're using for the vaccine production become sick with avian influenza, that then would impact our vaccine production supply. We haven't seen that happen, but there are, you know, projections, or, you know, just kind of keeping an eye on. And one of the reasons that we probably haven't seen that is that those did I just advance the slides by accident? Those specific pathogen-free chickens are housed in an entirely separate sites from commercial chicken for the food supply, and they have much tighter controls in terms of the conditions that they're grown in. So the biosecurity is higher. They're doing a lot more to the extent that they've also got filtered air positive pressure housing for these chickens. So they're working really hard to keep them free of any pathogens. There's something 20 something or 30 something pathogens that they test them for, that they have to be free and clean in order to use them for vaccine production. So we know that we can do a lot more in terms of prevention at these poultry factories, because we have a model of what we're doing for those chickens that we are being so careful with for the use of their eggs for vaccine production. However, that's costly, and it becomes trade-offs of thinking about what is it worth, and how much are we willing to spend, and what else can we do. So we can talk more about some of those things. This is just data on egg production and egg cost over the last year, looking at the fall in egg production and the subsequent spike in egg cost. No surprises there. And this is CDC data, looking at the detects in wild birds, the detects in poultry. And this is updated real time. I pulled it a week ago, but you can keep going to see kind of what the trends and patterns are. And I know you looked in your influenza lecture on a lot of the work that's being done in terms of surveillance. And so, like influenza in general, we've got surveillance going on for avian influenza. I'm going to talk a little bit more about it in a second. I already kind of started to get into this, right? But our big poultry farms are, they create conditions that make it easy for pathogens to multiply and potentially mutate and change. And then we have contact with humans because we're intentionally, raising and growing them. We create an interface between the animals and the humans. And so we have an opportunity for a virus to move between the animals into humans. And so there's, and we've seen this, right? We know this has happened. We can look at a lot of different examples, and not just in poultry. The big for avian influenza, we've also dealt with swine flu, and we've seen mixtures of these viruses changing, and kind of there's a lot of interesting research looking at kind of where did these genes come from and how did we mix, and did the bird move it into the swine, and then the swine and the human, and we had one animal with viruses from both, and then the genes mixed, and then we got the new virus. So they create great environments for those sorts of mutations. So once it gets in, then it moves like wildfire, and that's what we're seeing. Once it gets in, it's easy to have a big outbreak that kind of takes over the whole thing. So there's stuff that we can do, and that we are doing, and things that we could be doing more of, or things that we could be doing differently. Human immunization, right? The flu shot is one thing, right? How are we doing with, right? It doesn't, it's not a guaranteed prevention of infection with avian influenza, but it helps, right? And we can continue to improve upon our, we do it every year. We change what kind of genes are mixed into that. And so continuing to improve our human vaccines, and then doing a better job to make sure that the most at-risk populations are vaccinated. So that means anybody who works in these poultry factories, we want to have them vaccinated. So working on that is certainly important and would help. We don't have any policies around personal protective equipment. We have some guidelines and recommendations, but there's no real policies, there's no regulation, there's no enforcement, there's no incentive programs, and there's nothing around respiratory PPE. So mostly it's like people wear gloves, or they put some kind of covering over their boots, or they have to change their shoes, or they have to sanitize their shoes, or they do hand washing, right? These are kind of the recommendations for things that people should be doing who are working and in contact with these animals. But there's more that we could do. It's hard to keep it up and keep people doing it, right? We get this and we've seen this. It's hard on long term. So that's where the surveillance comes in. If we know when things are spiking in the bird population, if we can predict more when there's a higher risk of an outbreak in the animal factories, then we could kind of spike up our biosecurity, if you will, at those points in time, or we could do it all the time, or we could try, but it's hard to keep people doing. Although it's not impossible, right? There's requirements at workplaces, lots of different workplaces where people are in contact with harmful things in the air and they have to wear personal protective equipment, and that's part of the job. We could also pay people more, and it would be more, it would be easier to enforce things if the job were a more desirable job because it had a higher pay rate. These are some of the lowest paid workers. Something like $25,000 is the annual salary for people who work in poultry factories. Yeah. So another thing to be thinking about is the waste management, right? We talked in environmental health about the incredible risks for air pollution, for water pollution, and their contribution to emerging infectious diseases because of the waste that's generated by these factories, right? They have to get permits for hazardous waste when they're disposing of the manure. And so they often are in these open lagoons, outside of the facility, these big lagoons that hold the manure, and they are really conducive for that, reassortment and genetic change that we know happens. And so and not only that, but they're exposed to the wild, so there can be an opportunity for transmission there, right? So movement back and forth through the waste. There are alternatives to those big open lagoons that have been then tried, and there's certainly, I feel like a lot of the stuff that's out there in the literature and in the agency documents, it's all sort of assuming we're going to continue with status quo. We're going to continue to have big factory farms, and that's the way that it's going to be, right? There's also a reinventing of the wheel and doing things differently and raising our animals differently, so that we don't generate such massive waste, so that we don't have these big open or big closed, confined petri dishes of animals that become such great spreaders of pathogens, right? But the way that most of the things that you find is really kind of assuming we're going to keep going with these big factory farms. How can we manage this massive amount of manure in a different way? And then biosecurity, all those different measures of sanitation to kind of clean everything, the wheels of the machinery, and the people going in and out, and the egg trays, all the things that can carry the pathogen, doing more with sanitation and better with sanitation. And then how do we get that to happen? Well, so there's, the idea of incentivizing, doing like a positive reward system to get factories to do it, or a punitive system where you're going in and doing, spot audits and, finding people for violations, right? Those are, two very different approaches to try to get people to follow these types of guidance. But first we need the policies in place, right? We need to create the regulations and the requirements, and we need to kind of make sure that there is lots of good dissemination of the information and, buy on, right? That's a whole, just like any public health strategy, a public health outreach campaign, there's a whole campaign that has to happen to really make sure that we're doing these things and doing them as much as possible, assuming we're going to, we have factory farms, so they are what they are for now. But of course, I don't hide my biases. I really think that, we need to do things differently, but it's like any other public health campaign, right? It's a campaign, and then we have to create the policy and the regulations and the education, and then figure out how to make sure that it's happening. And those things can be challenging and have a lot of failures. And that's kind of, we experienced a pandemic and how we tried to do that, right? So we are familiar with the challenges around that. Okay. I think I've spent enough time talking about that. Moving on, and maybe I'm not moving on. This is more of the same thing. So I'm going to just kind of blast through this slide because I think it's just reiterating a little bit about what we have all talked about. These are the kind of some of the basic recommendations. This is from USDA, and these are recommendations for how to prevent flu. And these are all of the kind of biosecurity measures, or some of them that we just talked about. Okay, so I mentioned surveillance earlier. It's this opportunity for an early detection system to kind of warn and let us know of the potential for an outbreak coming. And we have through the WHO, the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response System. And then in the US, we have this interagency plan, the National Early Detection System for Avian Influenza. And so we've got across the world and across the nation, we've got sampling and monitoring to detect in wild birds and in poultry the presence of avian influenza. And this is, between, so from USGS data, this is the number of wild bird carcasses that were tested, the number of wild healthy bird swab samples that were taken between the 5-year period of 2016 to 2021. And so there's investigate the point, of course, right, is to be abreast of what's happening, to make sure that we're tracking areas that are where there's a potential for birds to be getting sick, and aware when things are increasing in those populations, and when we might be seeing an increased risk of spread into other animals, or into poultry specifically, which is where we've really seen our outbreaks for avian influenza. So there's investigation of any morbidity or mortality event in wild birds or poultry. There's surveillance of live wild birds. There's surveillance of hunter harvested birds. There's other sentinel species that are tested, and there's a whole detailed plan for how the surveillance should happen and can happen, right? Clearly, it's not an end all be all, because we still have, and we've had this in place and we still had an outbreak, right? And we're dealing with that. So again, I wanted to just poll you or get you to throw out some guesses. If you were going to create this kind of a surveillance system, where would you, or how, what would you use as a basis for deciding where to sample, right? We've got all these different wild birds, geese and swans and ducks and all different kinds of ducks and gulls, and where and which birds are you going to sample? I don't expect you to have the answer, but just throw out, hazard some guesses again.
Geese.
Say that again.
Geese, like Canadian geese.
Oh, geese. Okay, choose geese. And why? Why geese?
They migrate routinely, or I guess very frequently, more so than other types of wild birds.
Yeah, and they have a big migratory distance. So I think that's actually really key, is right, what birds are traveling where, and how far do they travel, and how many other types of birds do they have a chance to come into contact with, right? Because that's where we have an opportunity for mixing and spreading. So that's actually right on, is kind of picking a bird species. They pick the ones that have had it in the past, where they've seen it, and they pick the ones that are most likely to mix up with other birds in higher populations. And so here's data looking at 21, 22 sampling of avian influenza. And so this is just, these are wild birds and backyard flocks and commercial poultry. But what they're using when they go out and do these sampling is these flyways. So I don't know if anybody has heard of flyways. Are any of you actually on campus right now? When you're on campus on Mare Island is right in the Pacific Flyway. So there's a lot of birders who love to come to Mare Island, especially at certain times of year, to see the birds. There's a lot of great birding to be done on Mare Island. But these flyways, we know a lot through study and research of the birds. We know a lot about their paths, and they kind of follow the same path. It's not, right along the interstate or right around that, right? But they generally have these swaths that they go through and they return back and forth. Some of them go north on one route and south on another. But we have these flyways, and we know a lot about where there's mixing up of different birds on those flyways. And so on the right are the flyways. There's 4 major flyways in North America, but on the left, we've got these flyways that crisscross the continents. And so birds that are going to be moving, look at the green one here that kind of moves through parts of Europe and Africa and hits up here in wherever this is, Greenland, the north part of North America. And then it crisscrosses with several other flyways here, right? This is a great place for mixing to happen, right? Bringing things from one continent to another. Over here is the little bit of blue that comes from this flyway that goes through Asia, right? And that one's connecting with flyways here in North America as well, right? And then what we're sampling in the US are where we know that there's a lot of, larger populations and mixing of multiple different types of birds on their flyways. And so that's part of their deciding. There's lots of data on the population size and on previous incident rates of the virus, and they're using that information as well to kind of decide when they're sampling and where they're sampling and how much they need to sample to get good power on their statistics. I was going to mention here as well that as we see climate changing, we're also seeing shifts in these migration routes and shifts in the seasons of when things are migrating, right? Small shifts, a little bit. But those things are changing. And that, of course, changes which birds come into contact with other birds, right? And that increases the probability that we might see new virus variants emerging, right? And so kind of always like to kind of tie that back to what we're doing on our environment and how that's tweaking and affecting the transmission and in incidence of these diseases, of these emerging infectious diseases. And there are other things that we do to environment. This reminded me that I wanted to say that was there's other, contamination, just like we talk about our, resilience, health resilience. And when we have really good diets, we're more resilient to a lot of the different diseases that we might come into contact with. When we have really good diseases, and we're more resilient to the health effects of contamination that we might be exposed to. Birds are the same way. And so when they're exposed to environmental contaminants, their bodies can become more susceptible to other infections. So this is a study that was looking at mercury concentrations in the blood of these waterfowl, and found that the higher the mercury levels, the higher the mercury concentration in their blood, the higher the chance that they were to contract bird flu, right? So there's all these different interesting dynamics going on with how we, what's going on with what we're doing in our environment and how it influences these diseases. Okay, I'm coming. How much time? I haven't been paying attention to the time at all, but I'm coming up on the end, and I wanted to brainstorm with you about the potential for avian influenza to turn into a pandemic. So based on what you just heard and any other information that you might already know from the class or from your own learning, what things about avian influenza might lend itself to becoming a future pandemic?